This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week, I'm joined by landscape architect and podcaster Lisa Cutshaw, creator of the Plant Connection podcast. We explore how stories can deepen our relationship with plants, why reconnecting with nature is about more than simply being outdoors, and how folklore, history and observation can help us see the natural world in a new light.
I am a landscape architect, been doing it for 20 years, and I came to that from plant ecology. And I really wanted to do something that was connected with nature. I've always had an affinity for plants, so that was what I wanted to spend my time doing. And I came to landscape architecture because I felt like it was a more direct way to help people connect. And what I eventually found was that what I really want to do with my life is help people connect with nature. And so that's what I've been trying to do for decades now. And this is one more step in that direction.
And as a landscape architect, do you sometimes feel almost a little bit removed from nature? Because I know, coming from a design background myself, that sometimes you end up doing a lot of the admin, a lot of the desk work, a lot of stuff that's far removed from nature. Is this your effort to connect with nature yourself as well?
Well, very much so. Partly because, like you said, as a landscape architect, most of my time is spent at a computer. Even if I'm doing the design these days, it's almost all in AutoCAD, and I'm worrying about trying to dig into planning requirements, and am I meeting the law that's going to allow this to get passed so that someone can build what they want to build. And it becomes very much removed from what's the right thing to do in this situation sometimes. And so that's what I'm trying to do for myself as well, is move toward a life and a culture that has the right things in mind, the things that I think are right, which of course other people will disagree. But I feel like there's a reality to nature, a sense of coming back to yourself in nature that we often lose in the corporate world.
So what is it actually that you're doing at the moment that's kind of helping you reconnect and helping you help other people reconnect?
Right. So with the podcast, I'm trying to do it through storytelling, with the idea that a lot of people are just kind of rushing through their day. They've got a huge schedule and they're fitting everything in, and it's hard sometimes to find time to go out in the woods or into a park or whatever is available wherever someone lives. But it's not always that hard to turn on a podcast if you're already commuting somewhere or having lunch at your desk sometimes, right? Whatever it is that people are trying to do, if they're looking for a way to get a little bit of nature plugged into that, I'm trying to do that with the podcast in a way that's very accessible for people. So it's hopefully not dry. Hopefully it's interesting stories that bring us to plants in a way that we hadn't necessarily thought of before. But for myself, I get out in nature every day, but I'm blessed to live in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where all I have to do is walk out my door and up the hill. So I have it good.
I totally get that. And the podcast, I have listened to probably, I think, about half the episodes actually, and it's brilliant. But what I was going to say about podcasting, and I say this as a podcaster and a podcast listener, is sometimes it's like a two-pronged thing. Yes, you can get your nature fix from podcasts. The other thing that I found, though, particularly when I was gardening all day, every day, was that if I had podcasts in, it sometimes, and they weren't always nature podcasts either, they weren't always gardening podcasts, but sometimes it kind of had me at one remove from what I was actually doing. Do you think that's maybe a downside to the podcasting?
Oh, yeah. That's actually a problem that I've struggled with a little bit in starting a podcast as a way to help people, because it's nature through technology, right? Which is a little bit of a weird way to go about it. But my thought was, I'm trying to meet people where they are. And so there's people out there who are like us, who love nature, do everything they can to get out in it, and don't really need this podcast that I'm doing. And then there's folks who are kind of stuck in the rat race, I'll call it, of always having to be at work and be in their office and go straight home and cook dinner, and it's dark by the time they're done and they have to go to bed. And, it's not always true that they don't have time, but it is probably true from a perception point of view that it feels like they don't have time. And so, because most people are already plugged into the technology and using it anyway, having something that's there that they can easily access that becomes hopefully a stepping stone that prompts them to get out into nature in real life. That's my hope. That's my goal.
And actually, when I was thinking about the questions that I was going to put to you, that did come up because you said it's not necessarily the case that people need a podcast about gardening or nature if they're working outside. But sometimes I think, is there the danger that even if you're hands-on with plants all the time, you kind of forget to stop and smell the flowers because they're part of your job? So sometimes it is useful to have a reminder. And if that takes the form of a podcast that makes you stop and think, that's probably beneficial, actually, even for those people.
Oh, yeah. Actually, you and I think a lot alike, I think. One of the things that I've been struggling with a little bit is that just being out in nature, like you said, isn't necessarily building a connection with it. Years ago, I decided I didn't want to go hiking with a certain group of male friends anymore because when they went for a hike, their goal was to get to the top of the hill as fast as possible. And I was the one dragging behind, like, wait, there's a baby owl. I want to look. So just because you're all surrounded by trees or by beautiful nature doesn't mean you're actually mentally there and connected with it. And that's actually probably my next step in the evolution of what I'm working on is how do people connect? It's actually something I've talked about a little bit in my newsletter that I send out. What does it mean to have a relationship with an entity that can't necessarily talk back and have a conversation the way we're used to? So that's a really interesting thing to start to get into.
It is, because it's that question of being actively present in a landscape and engaging with it on a level. And I don't know how you go about that. I mean, I suspect part of it, certainly for me, is to go out in it without a phone, really, would be, I guess, my first thing that I would do if I was attempting it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The thing that I've been suggesting is to start through the senses and start intentionally noticing each of the senses. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? Obviously, don't go tasting plants unless you really know what you're picking, but that's one way to just slow down in the moment and spend a little time with exactly where you are.
And the other thing that I thought listening to your podcast was for you, and possibly for people listening as well, if they take an active interest in the plant you're discussing, how useful is it to focus on like the biography of a plant? Has profiling plants in depth helped you connect more?
I would say it has. And the interesting thing about it, at least for me, there's two ways that stories help. One of them is it just brings up the history of how other people have interacted with the plant, but it also, there's symbolism often in cultural stories about plants. And so sometimes those relate to, I'll call them archetypes, So for instance, when I did the white pine episode, I didn't know when I started out that white pine trees had been historically used by some Native American tribes as a meeting place for coming up with peace treaties, essentially. And one of them in particular became known as the Tree of Peace. And I feel like that symbolism, even though it's a human construct, we can use that as we're trying to connect, because then, we can make a white pine tree, or any tree really, but if we want to use that symbolism, find a white pine tree and make that our tree of peace. So I think there's ways to use it that storytelling can not just be an entry point, but also a tool that people can use to help feel more connected.
Yeah, I guess that, again, it's still a human-centric perspective, but that plant, you've imbued it with some extra layer of significance in your life, which again, I think helps things stick in the memory and helps give them a greater significance in your life, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's probably what I would consider one of my weaknesses in this whole thing, is that I don't know how to get beyond the human-centric. There's lots of times where I like to sit and kind of meditate with a tree, just kind of sit next to it and meditate. But there is a movement out there, forget what it's called, but basically there are folks who try to speak to the spirit of a tree, and I just don't know how to do it. If I ever figure it out, I'll share.
I mean, we've had people on the podcast before who've spoken about using psychedelics in order to connect with plant spirits. So I guess if that's your thing, that's maybe one thing. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know. I'm not the person to kind of comment on meditation because I have a very loud brain. So I struggle with it. But... So how do you pick what plants you're going to delve into? Do they just pop up at you and you go, aha, that's a good one?
Well, I've been trying to go seasonally, think about what's kind of most visible in the landscape at any given time. And so far, I am spoiled for choice because there's so many to choose from. Eventually, I'm sure I'll just start going through plants that intrigue me in some way. But I think seasonally is a good way to do it because it's another way if people are trying to get out in nature and they hear a story about a plant that, oh, that's probably blooming right now, or I can go to a botanical garden and see that right now. I figured that was one way to help people kind of get spurred on.
Yeah, that's a very good way of looking at it, actually. So you obviously mentioned the white pine, and that was surprising, the kind of peace element of it. When I was listening to your podcast, I was thinking, oh, I had no idea that was a thing. And I've been away and looked stuff up. But can you think of any particular examples where you were really surprised about what you found?
Yeah, recently I did an episode on rhododendron, and here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, rhododendron are everywhere. Like I can see one from my window right now. And they're beautiful when they flower, but they're also evergreen, so you always see them year round. And I have cousins who their bees make honey. And that's, for my whole life, I've always known people who have had homemade honey around. And I never knew that if the bees were to feed exclusively on rhododendron trees, that honey would actually be toxic. That was a total surprise to me. And that honey is called mad honey and has been used in historic examples for armies to fight each other. That was crazy.
Yeah, that's a good one. I guess every time you look into a plant, you're probably surprised by something that you find.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what I know about plants as a designer is what's available at the nursery and how we can use it, to create a nice space to meet the goals of the client. But when you start digging into it, plants are fascinating.
And might that influence your design practice going forward? Can you see a time when you might use a plant because of its backstory or because of its meaning or significance?
Yeah, I would love it if that happened. I think that that's probably going to enrich my design practice. Part of it will be the relationship with the client as well. Is this a person who this kind of thing speaks to? And, if it enriches their life as well, then absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe they don't even need to know.
Right.
There's a designer springing to mind who shall remain nameless. So in the UK, we have big flower shows and there's a lot of kind of gardens that get designed for them. And there is a particular designer who puts hidden symbolism into his gardens and only certain people kind of realise and then decode it. And it would have been done historically, presumably. It's only that we've fallen out of having this relationship with plants where there's symbolism involved to a lesser or greater degree. So, yeah, it's a good thing to explore going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually sounds like a lot of fun. Doing a garden for someone to decode would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it would. I'd love to do it if I had the time and patience and knowledge. But yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant idea. So one of the things that I was thinking when I was listening to the podcast was that this idea going back to that human-centric thing and reconnection, it's almost as if we're not really part of the greater whole. It's almost like we're sitting on the earth as a race rather than participating in it. What are your thoughts on that?
The way I think about it, like we have forgotten that we're part of nature and we tell ourselves that we're not, but we really are. I would love to see that. And hopefully that's where we're moving. I think there's a whole lot of people moving in the direction of trying to dissolve that false barrier and bring nature back into our lives and us back into nature.
Do you get much feedback from listeners who are kind of prompted to explore plants further or inspired by the episodes?
I do, and I love it when that happens because it feels like it's working.
Absolutely. So we talked about sort of reconnecting with nature, and, podcasting is one of the ways that you can get involved, whether you're creating one or you're listening to them. And obviously you said about, I think just the act of spending time in nature without distractions is very important, although not always easy to do. What other ways would you encourage people to reconnect?
What I wouldn't say is I'm not trying to get people to climb a mountain or do something that's really difficult. You don't have to go that far to start this process. Like, even if you only have houseplants, if what you do is intentional and you're spending time with them and focusing on them, that's a good starting point. If you can get out in a local park, even better, because one of the things that's amazing, and I know a lot of people don't need to hear research because intuitively we all know this is important, but research is finding all sorts of fascinating benefits to getting out into nature. And it basically boils down to, once you've gone through it all, reconnecting with nature helps you reconnect with yourself and with your community. So there's a huge domino effect of the benefits of this.
And again, that raises the question of, although it's kind of human activity, that community aspect is very, very important. And I think, again, we've lost a great deal of that. How do you kind of connect the plant stories up when you've got multiple cultures involved, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I've made a lot of effort for that. I focus a lot on stories that come out of the area that I'm from, just because I'm familiar with them. But I wonder if part of the benefit of looking at this culturally is because the storytelling is cultural. I wonder if the fact that our cultures have kind of come away from nature a little bit, I'm seeing in my head everyone kind of pulling their arms in, and maybe it's cold and it's wintertime and they're trying to keep warm. But once the spring comes, they can come back out and enjoy nature again. And maybe we're entering kind of a springtime of cultural life where we can all come out and talk to each other again. And maybe that's a way, maybe I should be looking at more of the different cultures and the aspects of how they look at these plants, because I'm sure there's common ground there.
I'm sure there is, but also important is local knowledge. It's becoming lost because we're becoming so homogenized in a cultural sense. So actually recording local regional knowledge is really, really important. I mean, do you get a sense that you're kind of capturing things that might otherwise just slip away in the mists of time?
Yeah, because the reason why I feel like that is because it's so hard to find these stories. In some cases, you really have to dig to find something. For instance, I have not yet done an episode on elderberry, even though it was going to be one of my first episodes. And the reason being, if you were to go on Amazon or a bookshop website and type in elderberry, you will find dozens and dozens of books that you can buy, but they're all about how to make, elderberry syrup and how to use it as a medicine and that sort of thing, which is all very important. But there's almost nothing that I've found so far that talks about it, as a cultural phenomenon. Finding a story about elderberry is quite difficult, at least so far.
I wonder if in the UK we've got more of a tradition around elderberry, but probably folklore from over here probably does factor quite strongly, I would say. And I guess it depends on where a plant originates from. I mean, that's going to come with its own cultural stories depending on where it calls home. So, yeah, I mean, apart from elderberry, you don't have to say, because I don't want you to give away any secrets, but, going forward, you mentioned that you might like to look at other plants that maybe aren't seasonal, but is there anything else that you're thinking of doing as if you haven't got enough to do?
Well, my next one up is redbud, which is a tree. One of the beautiful things about it is that it flowers before it leaves out. And so it's one of the trees right now here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and going north, you can easily find it. If you're just driving down the road, you can see the pink or red flowers off in the distance, and it's a beautiful little tree. So that's my next one. But yeah, branching out, I think, into more of kind of the exploration of what does it mean to have a relationship in a meaningful way with nature. That's my next step.
And I always like to kind of finish on when I talk to people who are creative and who've found, you know, an outlet that's maybe slightly off-piste from their normal day job, especially if they're working professionally in horticulture. I like to ask people if you could give somebody one task or one tip when it comes to connecting, what would it be?
Just do it. That's maybe not as helpful as it sounds, but don't think about it. Just step out the door and the first tree you see, spend a little time with it.
So, Lisa, where can people find out more about you?
Oh, sure. Rootstemleaf.com is the website. And of course, the podcast is Plant Connection, and it's on all the platforms, so it should be easy to find.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Lisa for an interesting conversation about plants, storytelling, and what it means to build a deeper relationship with the natural world. If today's episode has got you thinking about reconnecting with nature, finding meaning in the landscapes around us, and seeing plants through a different lens, you might also enjoy episode 53, Garden Design for Every Species with John Little, and episode 219, The Wheel of the Year with Rebecca Beattie. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his insect of the week.
The Harlequin ladybird. Scientific name, Harmonia axyridis. This week's insect of the week is a ladybird with a controversial reputation. It arrived into the UK approximately 20 years ago. It comes from originally Eastern Russia, Mongolia, China, Korea, Japan, and it's impressive in what it's done. It's colonized pretty much the entire UK in the space of 10 years. Just to give you context, it took the grey squirrel around 100 years to do the same thing. Insects are fast. It's got loads of names. The Americans do call it the Halloween bug because it congregates in large numbers around Halloween. It's usually the species that people tell me about in the winter when they say, oh, I've got hundreds of ladybirds around the windows. I have seen 7-spot ladybirds do it in a smaller kind of congregation, but usually the large numbered aggregations are harlequins. The scientific name Harmonia comes from ancient Greek, the genus harmos, fitting together or balanced beautifully in a symmetrical structure. So that's quite cute. The epithet is a bit confusing. It's unclear exactly which it comes from, but there's a plant genus called Axyris, which is Russian pigweed. It may just be that it was found on that originally. It also may come from the ancient Greek of axiros, which is something to do with being unshaven or rough. The diet, it's a big aphid feeder, Aphidophagus, but they also eat other ladybirds and other smaller creatures. So basically anything that's smaller than it could be on the menu. Even moth and butterfly eggs and larvae, which is maybe a little bit scary. Not sure the impact of that. There's not that much research done on the impact of it in a way. A lot of people malign it. It is suggested that the 2-spot ladybird, which used to be the most abundant one in the UK and Ireland, is now relatively scarce, and they think that might be the reason because it's much bigger. And it may be that it's predated it so heavily that it's reduced the 2-spot ladybird population significantly. It may be having big positive effects that we don't fully understand. The color combinations, it's a highly variable color patterned ladybird. Over 100 color patterns have been recorded, and it's the largest ladybird we have. So the size is usually the one for me in terms of identification. It can be confused with so many different ladybirds. I have people sending me all sorts of stuff saying, is this a 10-spot? Is this a water ladybird? And it's actually a harlequin. Took me a little time to get my eye in on the size, but the size is a big one. Any ladybird over 5 millimeters with brown legs is a harlequin, except for the scarce ladybird, which is found on conifers. As always, there is an exception. Over 100 color patterns, often orange or red and black spotted, but even black with red spots. So highly variable, exciting kind of thing, but we're not fully sure the impact of it. it is here to stay for sure. It was introduced into America and Europe, which is a bit of a mad fact for, aphid control, despite having all this huge diversity of ladybird already, which seems nuts, moving insects around the world for biocontrol when you've already got stuff to do it. Anyway, please take photographs of all ladybirds you see, because you never know, you might find something scarce. And you'll start to get your eye on the more common ones. As always, please record on the iRecord and iNaturalist apps and tag me anything interesting you see.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.